I would rather make the mistake of taking too long with people, which is another way of saying being more patient than I ought to have been, than slashing and burning and chewing people up and spitting people out.
Hi, welcome to the Tarun Stevenson Leadership Channel. I'm your host, Tarun Stevenson, and we are all about helping you lead, communicate, and grow to your full potential. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or your favorite podcasting app, don't forget to subscribe and follow so that you can stay up to date with all our latest episodes. All right, here's the latest episode. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, Tarun here, and I'm here with James Macpherson, who is an extraordinary leader. I've had the privilege of learning from him in the past, and I just wanted to bring him on the show to share some of his wisdom. He has been a journalist with News Limited, successfully led Calvary Church, which is a very significant, influential church in Queensland and South Africa, and now he's working as a vice president with Alpha Crucis in Sydney. Welcome to the show, James.
Oh yeah, I appreciate you making the time to talk to me.
It's so good to talk to you. I love listening to your podcast and your satirical take on politics. It's definitely a voice that we need in this generation, but great to have you on the show today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you? I've given the sort of overview, but tell us a little bit about your leadership journey, James.
Well, my leadership journey began 9 months before I was born. Conceived into a minister's family, so grew up in church and around leadership, and as a kid I only ever wanted to do two things: be a journalist or a preacher. Right. And I've already done both, so I've peaked early.
Great.
My life to go, so I'm not sure where we go from here. When I left school, I got a cadetship with News Limited, which means I'm wonderful or the devil, depending on your political but I did write for Rupert Murdoch for a number of years, eventually left the media and went into church ministry. And as you said, led Calvary Church, which was a local church in Townsville in northern Queensland. And then over the course of 9 years, we expanded from Townsville to 8 other cities, including East London in South Africa. And the church went from a few hundred people to around 12,000 over that 9 year. That was an absolute joy of my life to do that. As part of that church, we had a P-12 school with around 900 students, as well as a childcare centre, a theological college with about 120, 140 students in the theological college. And then transitioned to my current role in Sydney, where I am one of 3 vice presidents for Alpha Crucis College, which was the main theological college for our movement of churches, but has expanded to offer degrees in the social sciences, in education, in business, and is currently applying for university status. So that's my current role, and then in my spare time, I regularly write for the Spectator magazine.
Fantastic. And great articles, I must say. If that is your political persuasion, I recommend you go and check James out. But James, I want to start with perhaps when you joined Calvary. As you say, it was just a local church. I shouldn't say just, it was quite a significant local church in the Townsville area, and under your leadership grew to a significantly influential church with multiple campuses throughout Queensland and South Africa. How long were you in the initial church before you moved into a multi-campus format? I think Sunshine Coast was your next campus, is that right?
Yeah, it was. I'd been in Townsville 2 years, and previous to being in Townsville, I'd been an associate pastor at a church on the Sunshine Coast.
Right.
I left there to take on leadership of Calvary Church in Townsville. 2 years after that, my former boss, or the pastor of the Sunshine Coast Church, he resigned and asked if I would take that church on as well. I said to him, "Don't be crazy. I've only been in Townsville 2 years. I can't leave." And he said to me, "Don't you be crazy. why would you have to leave Townsville? Why don't you just pastor both churches, but stay in Townsville and use aeroplanes? So that's
Right.
how multi-site church. And then from there we expanded, to Cairns and into other cities. But in answer to your question, yeah, we'd been in Townsville 2 years before we then went multi-site.
So that must have been a fairly significant jump in your leadership. I mean, especially leading two organisations in different cities. You know, you can't even drive to your other organisation. You had to get on a plane and connect with your other teams. What sort of shifts did you have to make as a leader as you started to scale Calvary?
Yeah, there's a number of shifts. In terms of leadership, obviously it meant far more delegation and empowering of other people, because I just physically could not be present in the other location. And then, of course, you expand to 9 different cities. It's absolutely impossible to be everywhere. So certainly delegating and empowering responsibility and authority to other people was a major thing. The other thing was just adjusting in my own mind that I didn't have to be everywhere all at once. The use of technology as a leader became incredibly important. I guess COVID has forced that upon all of us now, right?
Yeah.
But back in those days, addressing groups of people via a video link was quite foreign. In fact, when I started speaking from Townsville to the congregation in the southeast corner of Queensland via video, people accused me of you're becoming one of those American churches, which meant using technology. As the only ones that have a mortgage on technology. But my point is, it was very foreign. So different styles of communication, leading, but through people rather than doing it all myself. And certainly learning to trust people a lot more since they were on the ground and I wasn't.
Yeah. So just tell me about that process for you as far as letting go of your hands-on approach as a leader. I know for a lot of small business owners that can be really challenging where as they start to grow, they have to stop doing the things that they've always done and trust it to somebody else. What was that process like for you? Did you find it easy, or was it something that you had to really work through, and how did you do that?
Yeah, I found it pretty easy because I realised fairly quickly I will become the lid of this organisation. And I think that's the reality of every leader. You become the lid.
Yeah.
And that you insist there are certain things only you can do. So the key to growth really became finding and identifying what are the things that I have to do.
Yeah.
And I guess my metric became if there was something that, to be honest, I don't have to do this, then I shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
And that really became the criteria through which I had to measure everything. So anything I was involved in, I would continually ask myself the question, do I have to be doing this, or could someone else be doing it? And if the answer was, well, I don't have to do this, then I shouldn't be doing this. Why am I doing this? I need to find someone who I can delegate this to as quickly as possible, because while I'm doing what you could be doing, no one is doing what I must be doing. And so that very key and continuous prism through which I viewed everything.
So it really is a case of finding your lane and what your unique skills are that you bring to the table and focusing on them, and then moving off all the tasks that can be done by somebody else.
Yeah, there are certain things that as the leader, as the CEO, as the manager, you just have to do that. But most leaders are doing a lot of things that someone else could be doing.
Yeah, gotcha. And so after you went to 2 campuses, you then it appears that you then started to scale a lot quicker, that you added a number of other campuses in much shorter succession after that. Did you find, and I've observed this of a number of churches that have gone to multi-site, it's the first one seems to be the one that takes time, but then after that, once you've got the systems in place, the subsequent ones seem to follow fairly quickly. Was it a systems thing, or were there some other areas that you found that really helped you to scale rapidly after that?
Yeah, look, to be honest, when we had two campuses, or if you want two franchises,
Yeah.
I didn't have a clue what I was making it up as we went.
Yeah.
When we went to three, I was still making it up as we went. And I found I could still work three. We were in Cairns, Townsville, the Sunshine Coast, and there was enough of me to go around and to still be pretty hands-on with it all.
Yeah.
But to go to four required major change in the way I structured our leadership, because I just couldn't fly to four cities. I couldn't.
Sure.
I think if you're talking church world, and sorry, I can't give you the exact statistic, but I do know that in terms of multi-site churches, three is the magic number. It's more than 80% of multi-site churches never succeed in going beyond three.
Right.
And I think that's because once you go to four congregations, it becomes about systems.
Yeah.
It's then not about your theology or your music or the air conditioning, or it's now about the systems that you have.
Yeah.
If we can talk Bible for just a moment.
Please, sure.
It's interesting to me in the book of Acts that the disciples are filled with the Holy Spirit. So it's a spiritual experience. The apostles have all got great doctrine and they're very eloquent in preaching the gospel. But very early on, the church hits a lid, and the problem is the administration of food. And the church stalls until that distribution of food problem is resolved, and then all of a sudden the church booms again.
Right.
Particularly for Christians, we think a lot of our problems are that we don't pray enough, or maybe there's something wrong with our theology or but actually in terms of expansion, systems become incredibly important. And anyone running a business would know this, obviously.
Yeah.
In business, you can have a brilliant product, but if your systems aren't set up to facilitate the distribution, the marketing, and so on, then it doesn't matter that you've got the best product in the world. You're still going to have a very small business if you don't put the right systems in place. Once you get the systems in place, your observation is quite correct. You can expand rapidly because the systems ought to be scalable.
Sure.
So the systems became the key, yes.
So for the leader who perhaps is a small business owner, mum and pop operation, or perhaps a small church leader, what are the systems that become critical at attacking in those early stages? If you want to move beyond those single person operations, what are the systems that really need the attention of the leader?
Is this for, are you talking about going in multiple sites or?
Well, multiple sites, or even just scaling their productivity or scaling their ability to increase capacity of customers, whatever scaling might look like for them. Are there critical systems that are required to give attention to for that scaling to begin?
I guess it's probably not what are the systems. It's more getting rid of unnecessary steps in the systems. So I'll give you a simple one. Your finance department, and all of a sudden you realise before any money can be spent, it's got to have 5 signatures, and 3 of the people aren't even on site. Now that's a silly example, probably, but as you go through the systems you already have and audit them, you often find just inefficiencies where there's no other explanation than the fact we kind of set it up that way 5 years ago, and we've never reviewed it, and so we're still but what worked 5 years ago has now become inefficient for the size of the organisation.
Sure,
become a barrier. So I think it's less about what systems and more about continually reviewing the systems we have and identifying and removing inefficiencies.
Great. So did that change for you as you continued to grow? At every level of growth, were there new areas that you had to redefine or rehash in order to go to that next level of growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're talking church world, I'll give you a simple example. When we were a small church, identifying new people was very easy. Look, there's a new person. Because, if you've only got a small number of people and a new person walks in the door, you know immediately.
Yeah.
But then when the church is thousands and a new person comes in, no one has any clue that a new person is there because I don't know half the people anyway.
Yeah.
So the identification of new people, that system, and the first system we had was look around the room and use your eyes to see the new person. There's a system. But then we needed a much more formal mechanical system rather than organic for identifying new people.
Gotcha.
Now, there was nothing wrong with the original system. Open your eyes and look around the room. But what worked when we were 100 people did not work when we were 5,000 people.
Yeah. Great.
Other examples, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, no. I get exactly what you're talking about. All right, I want to shift away from systems because really the conversation that I wanted to really have with you is around teams, and with your scaling of Calvary and working with multiple teams across multiple sites, your ability to maintain culture across these teams that are perhaps not under your direct oversight becomes... Sorry, go on.
Interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah, please.
Before we move to the systems idea, one thing I should add, the big point is that what works at one time, if it's wrong, it won't work down the track.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people go into crisis mode and think, oh, it's all falling apart. Well, the system you set up when you were this big will naturally start to fall apart when you're this big.
Yeah.
That's life. And that doesn't mean a failure in your leadership. It just means you've outgrown the system. So you need to recreate that system. One of the challenges is we typically ask other people what they're doing, and we import their system into our world.
Yeah.
And then we find 2 years down the track, the person we copied, they're not doing that anymore. They've moved to something else. And the reason is that systems should be always evolving and growing with the organization. You get into trouble when the organization is growing, but you don't grow the systems.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes you get real frustrated and think, why does nothing ever seem to work? And I found things only work for a season and then they don't work anymore. So it's continual reinvention of the old things.
Yeah. So it's not an indication of your ability to lead necessarily. It's an indication that the system needs review and it's perhaps reached the limit of what its potential ever was.
Exactly.
Great. Fantastic. So I guess that applies to teams as well, because when you're leading a small organization, managing a team, embedding culture with a small team is relatively straightforward because you have direct contact with those people as you start to scale, as you start to work across multiple sites. What are some of the challenges or the processes you have to work through to maintain close relationship with your teams and consistency of culture across those teams?
I think the first step in culture is you've got to know what culture you want, because there will be a culture. The question is whether it's the culture you wanted or whether it's the culture someone else wants.
Yeah. There
are plenty of churches where the culture of the church is not set by the pastor; it's set by the family that's been there for 3 generations.
Yeah.
And the preacher might be behind the pulpit, but there's a family that sit like this in the 3rd row, and they smile or frown depending on whether they're happy, and everyone knows, and that's so. The first thing is to know what you want.
Yeah.
And then I think you've just got to be relentless with what you want.
Yeah.
So for me, leading a church, and I'd grown up in church, and I just decided if I'm going to lead a church, I want to lead the kind of church that I would go to.
Yeah. Not
the kind of church you would go to. Now, if the kind of church you would go to happens to be the kind of church I would go to, well, then we're in luck. You'll love my church.
Sure.
A lot of pastors are leading the kind of church that everyone wants them to lead rather than the church they really feel God put in their heart.
Yeah.
And that applies to all areas of life, I suppose, where we're often trying to please everybody else rather than doing what we really believe is right for us in our own hearts.
Yeah.
And so I think the first step is identifying what sort of culture among your staff do you want? What are the non-negotiables? And then you've got to be ruthless with them.
Yeah.
And temptation oftentimes is to overlook a difference in culture because someone is gifted or talented.
Sure.
But I have found continually you could have a very gifted person, but if it's a cultural misfit or cultural mismatch, you're going to end up having problems. So knowing what it is that you want, the way you want things done, and continually reinforcing that over and over again. And when you see a violation of that culture, refusing to turn a blind eye to it, but addressing it immediately and keeping it strong.
Okay, so that really brings me to the question I'm really wanting to ask you about, and that you're known for being able to speak very directly to situations that perhaps, when in your political commentary, you're very direct about the way you speak. You don't pull any punches, and that's, I guess, why many people appreciate your style of communication, but it also can put people off. And in leadership, I know, shocking, yeah? In leadership, that need to be direct to maintain culture and to maintain consistency, how do you go about balancing that with the need to foster relationship and nurture team members? It feels like leadership in some ways has drifted towards coddling teams, and I find a lot of leaders are scared to have difficult conversations because they're afraid of the reaction they'll get back. And then, of course, on the other spectrum is you've got very direct leaders who don't know how to couch what they're saying in a way that is concerned for the well-being of their staff. And so how do you walk that line between being direct but also, because you were loved by your staff. I've met a lot of your staff and worked with some of them, and they looked up to you, they respected you and loved working with you, and I don't believe you'd grow that big if they didn't. But you still had to be, as you said, ruthless in the way that you addressed inconsistency.
And I think that's exactly right. Ruthless with the way you address inconsistency, but not ruthless with people.
Yeah.
So, the scripture says, speak the truth in love. And so if you just speak the truth, but there's no demonstrable care, then you soon become known as a tyrant.
Yeah.
If you simply care, but are never brave enough to speak any truth, then you're just spinning your wheels, and everyone's feeling really lovely about everyone, but you're not producing anything. So I think the extent to which people know you care then really provides a license for you to be able to speak into people's lives or into people's situations. So I think those two have to go hand in hand. I think in terms of church staff or business staff, the most important thing is to know this is what we want in terms of this is how we're going to behave, and let's agree on those. And so then if something arises and I need to speak to you about it, I'm speaking to you about these are things we agreed on. We agreed that one of our cultural standards is excellence. Means we will do the best we can every time. So I'm looking at that, and I just need to know, was that the best you could do? If you say, well, I did. So, okay. So we agreed we will always give the very best for everything. So in that instance, less than your best is a violation of who we've agreed to be. So I can't have that. So we'd have those conversations. But I'm not hijacking someone or ambushing someone out of left field where they've got no idea what I'm talking about. And I think this is one of the problems for teams where leaders don't set clear expectations. Then something happens that they're not pleased with. They address a team member, and the team member is a bit shocked because this is the first time I'm hearing about this.
Yeah.
I think really clear expectations that have been agreed upon up front really help. And I think making sure that you've built relationship and that people know you genuinely care about them. That you're not just using them to build your ministry or your business, but I actually, in the process of building the church, I actually want to build you and your family. In the process of building our business, I actually want to build the lives of all of my staff so that
Yeah.
whether you're on the team for 2 years or for 20 years,
Mm.
when you leave, you'll say, you know what, I'm a better person for having worked with James Macpherson.
Great.
That was one of my goals, that people would say, I'm actually a better person. I'm actually a better leader. I'm further down the track than I would have been if I hadn't have worked for him. And I think if people know that's your attitude towards them, and if it's genuine, then people actually want difficult conversations. That they want you to confront them when they're not cutting it, because most people know when they're not cutting it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing worse than doing a job where you feel like you're failing.
Mm.
So you actually really want someone who cares about you to pull you aside and say, hey, and if you agree with me it's not, all right, let's talk about why it's not and what we should do.
Mm.
I think people appreciate that.
Okay. So let me pick that apart a little bit. You mentioned excellence. I know that's just one expectation, but excellence sometimes can be subjective. You know, as a leader, we often have an eye for detail that our teams don't, or we have a level of experience that our teams don't. And so when we say, are you doing your best? In their perception, they may be doing their best, but in your perception, it may not be the best that you think they're capable of. How do you walk that line between knowing your expectation and knowing their capability and meeting in the middle with that?
Well, I don't think there's a meeting in the middle. I think if you know their capability,
Yeah.
You can't expect more of people than they're capable of.
Sure.
It's one of the important things in hiring, isn't it? You can't hire a person who you acknowledge is a 4 out of 10 and then expect them to operate at an 8 out of 10 level.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of staff appointments go wrong, is we simply appointed people who, for whatever reason, we appointed them, but they weren't able to do what we wanted them to do. You're right, it is subjective because excellence and perfection are different, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I've got children, and an A on their English test is expected for one.
Mm.
A C on the same English test is expected for another.
Right.
And if this child got an A and this child got a C on the same test, I'd be equally happy with both.
Yeah.
Because this kid's a C grade kid. And if he gets a C, that's the best he could have done. I'm thrilled and as delighted as I am with the child who got the A.
Yeah.
I think that's important to remember when you're dealing with staff, which is why I don't think you can expect perfection, but what you do ask for is that every person gives it their absolute best.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So what about the times when you have team members who you've had those conversations with and yet they keep repeating the same behavior? What's the process that you follow when you shift from perhaps confronting the expectation in love and actually addressing a deeper attitude or a apathy that is becoming toxic to the team or toxic to the organization?
Yeah. When attitude becomes toxic, you cannot ignore that. You just cannot. That becomes like a cancer that spreads. It's interesting, you know, you can train people to upskill, but it's hard to train someone in attitude.
Yeah.
And so where attitude is wrong, or where there's a reticence or a reluctance or a sheer refusal to embrace the culture and embrace what we're all about, you do have to deal with those quite directly. And I work on this premise. If you've got a bad attitude, you're probably not enjoying being here.
Yeah.
If you're refusing to embrace the culture and embrace the organization, then this probably isn't the place of your dreams. So not only is it unhelpful for me as the leader, it's probably not real healthy for you. I used to have this with, as a pastor, you get people in your church who, for whatever reason, decide they didn't like the church anymore. And when you go and tell your pastor that you're leaving the church, you kind of expect, try and twist your arm into staying, because no pastor ever wants people to leave.
Sure.
So, some pastors chase people down the road saying, please don't leave, please come back. But sincerely as a pastor, if you just aren't enjoying the church, then you know what, I never want anyone to leave the church, but nor do I want people to sit in the congregation resenting the place.
No.
There's a lot of churches in the city and they're all good. Not as good as mine, but they're all, good. And so honestly, I just want you to be happy. So if you and your family would be happier at the church up the road, I'm not saying I want you to go, but if that's the truth, then look, I just want to see you in a place where you're happy, because where you're happy, you'll flourish. I would say that to a congregation member. I would also say it to a staff member. Look, it's clear you're not happy here, because if you were, you'd be embracing the culture, you'd be enthusiastic, you'd be responding, but we're continually speaking about the same things, which says to me there's a reluctance on your part to lay hold of things. So I would talk like that, where I'm as interested in their welfare and welfare as I am the organisation.
Great.
Because if you're doing well, the organisation will be doing great, and vice versa.
Yeah. So there's an old adage in leadership: hire slow and fire fast. What do you say to that adage? Is that something that you embrace, or do you try to pace yourself as far as getting rid of people if they're not fitting in well?
The truth is, I did help a few people find greener pastures, and I'm pretty sure everyone who I moved on, in hindsight, I probably should have moved them on a year earlier than I did.
Okay.
But if I'm going to make a mistake, I would rather make the mistake of taking too long with people, which is another way of saying being more patient than I ought to have been, than slashing and burning and chewing people up and spitting people out. I never want to run an organisation where we do that to people. This is just my conviction. I always felt the organisation was big enough to recover from someone who'd probably been there a bit longer than they ought to have been.
Yeah.
But I'm not always sure that people were able to recover, particularly from a church, if they got spat out unfairly or without grace or without due concern. So in answer to your question, I've heard that adage, and I think it's true. Hire slow, fire fast. In terms of the firing fast, I think probably, I'm sure all the people that I eventually moved on, in hindsight, I should have done it a year earlier than I did. But I'm glad that I erred on the side of taking longer than I ought to have, because people are really precious.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. So I'm interested in this, like, I'm loving this conversation, and I'm interested in this almost dualistic nature that an outsider may have perceived of you. When we listen to your satire, you can be very cutting, very in your face about current issues. But it's quite obvious you're a genuinely caring person, and you're a caring leader, and you love people. I mean, that's and anyone that's gotten to know you up close knows that to be true. So how do you work with, say, with younger generations, Gen Z, Gen Y, who seem to have a very low tolerance to perhaps humor around sensitive issues or sarcasm? How do you work with those sort of generations who, you've got this cancel culture where you make an inappropriate joke and people lose their mind, and yet that seems to be your brand of humor? What do you do in those situations?
Let me say a couple of things on this. Firstly, think about what you've just described, and I think you're accurate. What do you do with a generation that's lost its sense of humor?
Yeah.
So let me pick that apart for a second, because I think it's an interesting choice of phrase. A generation and you're quite right. Nothing's funny anymore.
Mm.
So is it just that anyone born in that period of time? Is there something in the air? Well, there is. It's called progressivism or leftism.
Yeah.
Or if you like, cultural Marxism. The Ayatollah Khomeini famously said there are no jokes in Islam, and there are not allowed to be any jokes in Islam because it's a fanatical, highly ideological system which looks no dissent. Cultural Marxism is a fanatical, highly ideological worldview that brooks no dissent. Cancel culture. And so you're not allowed to laugh, which is why Jerry Seinfeld doesn't do stand-up comedy anymore, and why so many comedians won't go on university campuses anymore, because instead of getting laughs, they get riots.
Yeah.
So I just don't think we should pander to that. I think we should confront it and encourage people to grow up a little bit.
Yeah.
In answer to the other thing you said, I think when you're talking politics, you're right. My style is probably quite direct, and I like to make fun of things because I think one of the best ways to dismantle a bad idea is to mock it.
Right.
You remember the story about the emperor's new clothes, and he's parading down the street, and everyone's admiring his new clothes, even though they can all see he's nude. No one's game to say anything, so everyone claps and says, "Oh, wow, you look amazing," and he's actually wearing nothing. All it takes is for one child in the crowd to start snickering because he's, I can see his willy. And all it takes is one person to laugh and the jig's up. Yeah. That's why certain ideologies cannot tolerate humour, because if you start laughing, people will all start realising how ridiculous this is. Yeah. So you're not allowed to joke. It's a big problem in our culture right now, and the sensitivity to everything, which makes almost anything impossible to say. Yeah, yeah. We're getting into cultural issues now, but if I can make one further point, please. A big concern is that we're allowing this to come into the church, and the church is the voice of. As Christians, we believe that the church is the voice of truth. World. And the gospel is always going to be offensive on some level. If the kingdom of God is different to the kingdom of Australia or the kingdom of America or the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, then at some point the gospel is going to be offensive to every culture and to every ideology other than kingdom mindedness. And so if we've got people coming to church but with an expectation nothing should be said from the pulpit that violates my feelings or that offends my sensibilities, then we just can't have church anymore. So we've got to be very careful in the church that we don't start pandering to this idea that if someone is offended, that in itself is evidence of prima facie evidence of a crime having been committed.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit more in terms of leadership, because I hear exactly what you're saying, and I'm of the same opinion that for some people they just need to grow up and they need to toughen up a little bit. But in an age where you've got so many people that are hypersensitive, that cry abuse or cry, inappropriate leadership or whatever it might be, how is a leader? Because I think a lot of leaders walk on eggshells because they're too scared to say anything that could be remotely controversial in the fear of being sued or being accused of something they haven't done.
I don't think that's true. I think most pastors are afraid of saying something in case they lose people.
Okay.
I don't hear a lot of pastors saying, "Oh, I'm worried I'm going to get sued."
Right.
But I hear a lot of pastors. I don't hear a lot of pastors. No one says it, but those of us who have been around long enough know there are certain things I don't want to address because someone will get upset and I'll lose a whole lot of people out of my congregation.
Yeah.
So I think that's more the point. And I think that's a great pity.
Yeah.
Because if the church you've built has been built on the foundation of you're going to stay because I'm not going to say anything that offends you, you don't have much of a church.
So what about in the broader context then? Because I do a lot of training in schools and I work with teachers who, the education system is one system that perhaps has made significant efforts to coalesce to the squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
And yet when I do training, I speak very frankly about a lot of these issues and find teachers saying, yes, I wish somebody would say this more often. And so there's a lot of leadership within the education that seems to say, we better, we've got to be careful about this stuff, and doesn't really want to say anything. And that may be true in business as well. So how do you approach it from the perspective of needing to, some things just need to be said, and everyone's thinking it, but everybody's too scared to say it.
Can't afford to say it.
Yeah.
If I can give you an example, the leading voice against the whole transgendered ideology at the moment, particularly the idea of children transitioning to a different gender, the leading opponent of that, or the most vocal opponent of that right now in the world, is J.K. Rowling.
Right.
Yeah. Why would the author of Harry Potter be the loudest voice speaking into the whole trans ideology? I'll tell you why. Because what's anyone going to do to her? She's already got more money than she'll ever need in her life.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say anything about that, because if I get sacked, I can't pay my mortgage next week.
Yeah, right.
And so most people can't afford to say the truth. Now, if you're going into a school, then I'm going to be very careful, because I don't want to be thrown out.
Sure.
So I'm going to have to be very careful speaking about all sorts of issues to make sure that the words I use are carefully selected, and that I don't get myself cancelled or sacked. But I think people are so starved for someone to speak plain truth.
Yeah.
That when someone does, like you said, you get all these people saying, "Oh, it's great to finally hear that." I think there's a real hunger. And our churches need to realise this. People are not going to church to hear what they've heard on the project.
Yeah.
They want to hear truth.
Yeah.
And this is the problem with the church. When the church becomes like the world, there's no need for the church. But back to your point, in a business setting or in an education setting, people have a sense that things aren't right, but when they hear truth, it resonates deep within.
Yeah.
And sometimes the truth doesn't have to be a hammer. It's amazing how just a drop of water sometimes will cause a green shoot in the desert.
Yeah.
And I find you've got to communicate differently in different environments.
Yeah.
So when I'm writing for The Spectator, I don't pretend that I'm anything other than I'm not. Bang, there it is. But that's why people read The Spectator.
Yeah.
If you're going to read The Spectator, you don't want to read an article and go, you want to read the article and you say, I love that, or you say, I hate that.
Yeah.
Either is fine. Yeah. But if you were going into a school to speak, well, I don't want the school administration to say, we hate him, hate what he says. So I'm going to be very careful in what I say and how I say it.
Sure.
You can say things in such a way that people have got a heart to hear truth. That they sense it and they hear it and they resonate.
Okay, so look, I don't get into politics really on this show at all, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the dichotomy we seem to have in culture now, where the loudest voice seem to be very liberal, like with the media and just popular culture. Yet across the Western world, we've seen conservative government after conservative government be elected by what Scott Morrison called the silent majority. And it's quite obvious that there is a large base of people that are tired of the extreme leftist rhetoric. And yet that seems to still, I mean, in a business world, it's supply and demand. If people are not buying what you're selling, you change what you're selling. But yet that rhetoric seems to still be being pushed irrespective of what's the polls politically seem to be saying. Where do you think this split has happened, and and how do you see it moving forward, into the next, say, election cycle?
Well, in answer to your first proposition, the loudest voices seem to be from the left. That's absolutely true, and it's because most of our media, now there are a couple of examples, but by and large, the majority of our media are left of centre.
Mm.
And that's just a reflection of our universities.
Sure.
I think you'd find most of our school teachers are probably left of centre as well, and again, reflection of our university. So if you're talking left and right or progressive, conservative dichotomies, I don't think I would get much argument in positing that progressives or the left have gotten control of the key institutions,
right?
Education, media, Hollywood.
Right.
And so the discourse, if it has an accent, it's certainly a leftist progressive accent.
Right.
Why then, your second point, have we seen conservative politicians elected in America, Australia, Poland, other Western nations, the UK, although I'm not sure Boris Johnson is that conservative? My answer to that is because conservatism works.
Right.
And I think leftism sounds very appealing, which is why, the 20th century surely proved that socialism does not work.
Yeah.
It ends up, wonderful ideals just end up with bodies in the streets.
Yeah.
And yet there's the old adage, socialism works, it just hasn't been tried properly yet. Because it appeals to that part of that noble part of all of us of compassion and wanting fairness and all of those high-minded ideals, which are all good. The problem is those ideals on their own just don't work. And so eventually say, look, my family's falling apart. I haven't got a job. There's riots in the streets. I can't afford it. And so then they go back to tried and true values of conservative. So I think that's the reason why you get the media, you get Hollywood, you get the education system saying one thing, and yet people, in key parts of the Western world at the moment are voting quite differently. We'll see what happens on the 3rd in America. But I think
it'll be interesting.
Does that make sense? That's
how it does. It reminds me of a passage in Micah where he says, "Do justice and love mercy." It's like there's this tension between the two, and I think with a lot of progressive views, they have at the heart of them a desire to be merciful to people, or to be compassionate with people. But then there seems to be in order to be compassionate, I need to suspend with the order, the justice of things. And then conservatives seem to want to keep order, keep justice intact, and can sometimes do it at the expense of compassion. How do you walk that line? Especially as a Christian, our ethos is to be, to love others. And yet there is a necessity to maintain a sense of order and justice within the chaos.
I'd put it quite simply like this. The big phrase in our culture has been for a decade now, tolerance. Yeah. And we've deified tolerance. By that I mean our culture says tolerance is always good and you must always and only be tolerant.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, a culture that is always tolerant cannot long survive. A hospital that is tolerant of unhygienic wards ends up with people dying. A police officer that is tolerant of people running red lights ends up with people dying. An architect who is tolerant of bad math ends up with the bridge collapsing and people dying. So tolerance is required, but so is intolerance.
Yeah.
So then you have to delineate what's tolerance for and what is intolerance for. So here's how I would see it. Tolerance is for people and always for people, but only for people. Intolerance is for bad ideas.
Okay.
And always for bad ideas, but only for bad ideas. So we are meek with the erring, but violent with the error.
Right.
I'm tolerant with the person while intolerant of the person's bad ideas.
Mm.
I've got to learn to love you and disagree with you at the same time, which is really the essence of Christianity, because that's what God has done for us.
Yeah.
On the cross, I'm not sure whether all your viewers are churchgoers or not, but they will be after this. But the simplicity of the Christian message is that on the cross, Jesus is completely intolerant of sin, whilst being fully tolerant of sinners. He was so intolerant of sin, he died, but so tolerant of sinners, he took our place for the dying.
Right.
I don't think it's very complicated. Another way to put it is we should be charitable, but with clarity, charity and clarity at the same time. So I can have clarity about ideas while being charitable to a person who has different ideas. But our culture says, well, if you love someone, you won't dare criticize their ideas because that means you hate them.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very immature culture.
Yeah.
Doesn't understand the difference. I hope I'm not being too controversial. I don't mean to be, but there's a difference between a Muslim and Islam. I'm a Christian, so you would expect I disagree with Islam. Otherwise, I'd be a Muslim, right?
Sure.
So as a Christian, I disagree with the ideas of Islam. By definition, I'm a Christian.
Sure.
But I know numbers of beautiful Muslim people, and it's no contradiction for me to disagree quite passionately with Islam, whilst loving wholeheartedly Muslim people.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I don't want to be too controversial, but because I know people have different ideas, but I would posit that you could disagree with same-sex marriage. We had that debate a number of years ago, whilst genuinely loving and caring about people of a different sexual orientation.
Sure.
And a culture that says, unless you agree with my ideas, you hate me, is a culture that will stagnate because there's no longer any opportunity to talk about ideas. You can't, because the moment you talk about ideas and you disagree, now you're a hater. You can't have hate because hate leads to violence. So all disagreement is shut down, which means all discourse is effectively finished. How can a society progress?
Yeah. So let me press you on that. Play the devil's advocate. You've made the distinction between ideas, or specifically bad ideas, versus people. I think probably one of the geniuses of progressive ideology over the last 20 years has been to conflate the ideas with the identity. And so now you're not criticizing an idea, you're criticizing a person. And I guess the response would be, well, who are you to say that my idea is wrong or bad? And who are you to say that my identity is not appropriate? So how do you separate the two out and, as you say, challenge an idea without condemning a person in a world where the two have really become one?
Part of the problem is that we no longer believe in objective truth. There's my truth. So how can you tell me my ideas are wrong? How dare you say I'm wrong? Well, I guess if there's no such thing as truth, if up or down is entirely dependent upon your personal preference, then I guess I can't tell you you're wrong. Yeah. But just at least be consistent. If you're going to take that view, then at least agree with me that we can't say Adolf Hitler was wrong either.
Right.
So see, this is where most people are unconsciously contradictory within themselves, because they say, well, it's my truth, but then they reserve the right to be able to say Adolf Hitler was evil. Yeah. Well, if truth is relative and it's all just personal preference, Adolf Hitler had a preference for gassing Jews. Well, I guess that was just him. Wasn't wrong. That's just how he rolled. Now that's an abhorrent thing to say. Sure. That's where the idea of relativism, that, well, who are you to say my ideas are wrong? This is what I think. It's my opinion. My opinion is my opinion. It's my truth. That's where that ultimately leads. So you've got to be consistent.
Yeah. Great. So in the context of leading your teams, you're going to be leading people that perhaps come to you with different worldviews and different ideas. How do you lead people that perhaps see the world differently and still keep them on the same page as far as your organization? Let's say church, but business, school, whatever it might be.
I think there you've got to work out what's essential and what's not essential. So obviously in a church, there are certain things that we're bound together by our beliefs.
Yeah.
And within the church, there are a wide range of beliefs on a whole lot of different things. But there are certain beliefs that would be essential. And if you believe contrary to this, well then, you know what? You're a great guy. I love you, but how can we walk together if we're pulling in different directions on some pretty fundamental things?
Yeah.
I would suggest in a church, because a church, by definition, you've got a doctrine. You come together over doctrine, over these are the points of our belief. So I think you've got to be very strong on the things that are essential. You've got to be very careful not to make a big deal of things that, in the end, you know what, you and I think very differently on that, but that is the basis of our fellowship together. So we'll agree on that and get on with life, you know.
All right. So in an organization that perhaps has not defined those things as clearly, or they don't work from a doctrinal statement or have government legislation that guides them, but yet the owner of the business wants to make a stand on particular issues that they see as important, and that can sometimes come back and bite them. I mean, the recent case of Southwest Airlines trying to deny a lady getting on the plane because the staff believed her dress was inappropriate, and so it became a really controversial news item because of the subjectivity of their dress code and what it actually meant. How do you make those value statements in a world of ambiguity or lack of objective morality, when once you put your stake in the ground, you're going to attract people that want to challenge that for the sake of making a point?
Yeah, what you do is you just continue electing progressive governments, and they will spend your taxes creating massive bureaucracies who will tell you what you can and cannot ask or insist upon. I'm being facetious.
Of course.
Look, I mean, for a business, it's a legal minefield now, right?
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about hire slow, sack fast. I'm not sure it's that easy to sack fast these days. There's a whole to go through, otherwise unfair dismissal hearings await you. So in answer to your question, it's very difficult as a business person to insist on certain things, because in the current legal environment, you don't have the right to insist on certain things amongst staff. So I think you've just got to be very careful the way you hire, and just keep the main things.
Yeah. It's great. Look, I would love to riff on this for a lot longer, but I'm mindful of your time. Is there anything you'd like to share, any last minute thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap this conversation up, James?
Not really. You've exhausted me.
Thanks.
No, not unless there's something you felt we've missed, or that we need to talk about more. But I've enjoyed our chats. It's nice.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it too, and I'd like to continue this chat at another date. But James, if people want to get in touch with you or follow your work, where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter. Just James Macpherson, MacPherson, James Macpherson. Or if you want to read some of the stuff I'm writing, if you go to the spectator.com.au site. And my podcast is available at goodsource.news.
Great.
Who can find me there?
Yeah, and I highly recommend the podcast. Highly entertaining, but also very informative, as this conversation has been. James, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for catching up.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you got a ton of value out of that episode. Don't forget to let us know what you thought in the comments, and if you have a topic you'd like us to cover next time, we'd love to hear from you. If you know anyone that would benefit from the content that we produce, please like and share this channel, and we look forward to having you next time on the Tarun Stevenson Leadership Channel.